addition to some of the intro stuff that we did last day, Hume is the ultimate skeptic. All right, so we've kind of touched upon this concept of skepticism already with the epistemology unit. Skepticism is that concept, that line of thinking where we can never know anything, according to the skeptic, according to skepticism. All right. We take everything at a sense of sort of disbelief or, disconnection. And so when it comes to thinking about how we come to know things, how we come to understand the world around us, there is no way, according to Hume. And that's kind of a scary thought, right? That, we're trying to figure out the world around us, and Hume just comes along and says, yeah, you'll never know. So don't bother even trying.
Yeah, someone in our class was actually saying it was like, because they had to do a presentation on him, but it was like he believed that people were like bundles instead of like an actual being, and these bundles are like a collective that collects sensory perceptions. I don't know, it was hard to understand during that presentation, but that's like the basis of what they were trying to explain from it.
Yes, that fits in line, right, with the idea here. When it comes to our understanding of the world according to Hume, again, everything's disconnected, right, for him. When it comes to our sensory perceptions and the information we gather from our senses, right, and again, our senses are kind of where we have to start. With any knowledge of the world that we get, our knowledge has to start with our own sort of sensory perceptions and what we perceive, right, from the world. And this happened to come from any of those philosophers we looked at right from the very beginning of this unit. So looking at Locke, looking at Berkeley, even looking at Nagel, right? All the information that we get from the world around us is all centered around how we perceive the outside world, all right? So all that sensory data that we get from our eyes, from our nose, from our ears, and our nerve endings, and our skin, all that stuff, right? All the sensory perceptions kind of give us this data or this information to kind of understand the world. But for Locke and Berkeley and Nagel, well, Locke and Berkeley more specifically, that sensory information is supposed to tell us real, actual stuff that happens outside of us. All right. For Locke, there was that connection, right, between secondary qualities to the primary qualities. Right? The secondary qualities, the sensory data that we get and interpret, tells us something about the primary qualities or the outside stuff that is extended from us, that is independent of us. Berkeley took all that sensory information, that data that's given to us, and he says, well, really there's no such thing as the primary stuff because we have no access to it, so it must also be secondary because it's also being interpreted. But there's no disputing the idea from either of those philosophers that they believe that there is a world around us, right, that we can know in some way. Hume looks at that sensory data and that sensory information as just simply information that we kind of make some interpretations of, and we make guesses as to what the outside world is all about. We have no idea, according to Hume, whether there's actually a connection between what we receive for our sensory data and what we make of the world around us. We hope that there is some sort of connection, but we can never know. And so anytime, like we looked at the example yesterday where I dropped my keys, right? I do 1 trial, 2 trials, 3 trials where, the keys, as soon as I let go, they drop down to the table and make this loud clang, all right? And so successive trials tells us about that situation. So if I do, a trial or 2, all right, we can hazard a guess that the 3rd time it's going to fall as well. I do 4 or 5 trials, I hazard a guess that the 6th trial is going to yield the same result. If I do 1,000,000 trials, now I've got some pretty reasonable assurance that when I let go of my keys, they're going to fall and hit the table. All right? Is that a guarantee, though? What did you learn from your logic unit? No. right? That's inductive logic. We can have a reasonable assurance. There is a probability, a high probability, that that's going to happen again, right? So trial 1,000,001, drop the keys, what's going to happen? They're going to hit the table, all right? I don't think any of us here would argue that possibility, all right? We know that that's the most probable result. But is it a 100% guarantee? No. Because anything could change that, right? When we look at, say, for instance, I hold this set of keys up above the table, and then suddenly, this room happens to be in a rocket ship, right? And we get blasted up into orbit, and I let go of my keys. Well, what's going to happen? Well, they'll float. They don't fall, right? Or how about the other situation, more mundane? I drop my keys, so I'll hold my keys up in the air, I let them go, and then Jordan runs along and he grabs the keys before they hit the table. Right? So they fell, but did they hit the table and make the big clang? No. We changed the situation. So it's not 100% guarantee that when I let go of my keys, they're going to drop and hit the table and make that big loud clang. But for Hume, he says that those connections that we make are necessary to our understanding of the world. We make these suppositions, we make these hypotheses, test, and conclude, all in a very scientific way to tell us about the world around us. What we have to accept, according to his philosophy, is that it's never 100% guarantee. That it's always going to be a probability. Is it going to be high probability, low probability? That's going to make a difference, all right? But given enough trials, given enough sort of information, we can make, again, reasonable, educated guesses as to the outcome of any of those situations. And so that's what we want to kind of look at with Hume. For Hume, everything's about making those connections to tell us about the world, but it's all built on what he calls habits. Habits form what we call necessary connections, or what he calls necessary connections. And those necessary connections are the chain link between cause and effect. So we see a cause, we link it to an effect. There is a necessary connection that we make between those two in order for us to understand the world around us. But it's not a guaranteed truth. It's just a habit we've formed to make the correlation between a cause and effect. So as you read Hume, that's what we want to take from it, right? Is that we build up our knowledge of the world, but it's not guaranteed absolute knowledge. This is the skeptical view. Is this something that will prevent us from realizing the nature of the world around us? Yes, in its most absolute sense. But for most intents and purposes of us being human beings, kind of winding our way through the world and being able to navigate it, this is all we need. And for Hume, he says, that's enough, right? As long as we have enough to make those causal links between cause and effect, as long as we can build up necessary habits that allow us to walk our way through this world, then that's good enough. And again, that's kind of what you want to take from Hume here. If you want to turn to page 123, this is where the inquiry concerning human understanding begins. And we'll do a bit of a read through and see how we get through that. Okay?
Mr. Vaughn?
Yeah.
So every philosopher that we were talking about before, well, at least most of them, they also presented their ideas around cognito ergo sum, right? Like, I think, therefore I am.
Any of the philosophers that we've looked at in the epistemology unit already take it for granted that we do exist.
Right.
And so when it comes to epistemology, epistemologists, they've already dispensed with the metaphysical question. Right? The metaphysical question being, do we actually exist and what is our place in the world? Right? For the epistemologist, it's already a given. It's already assumed. We exist. We know that there's a world around us, but how do we access that knowledge? That's what's important to the epistemologist. And so when you look at any of the sort of divisions in philosophy, or the pillars of philosophy, sometimes they're referred to as, Every sort of philosophical school of thought looks at the world around us, or again our place in it, from a very specific perspective. When it comes to the metaphysicians, they want to look really at the questions of existence, because for them it's not a given. It's not taken for granted that we actually exist, and that the world around us actually exists as some sort of matter, substance, or what have you. And so a lot of metaphysics is centered around answering that very question: do we exist? So when Descartes looks at that nature of existence, that question of existence, the cogito argument, that's where Descartes actually falls into metaphysics. Not to say that all philosophers are that compartmentalized.
So how does Hume fit in, though? Because
No.
you just suggest that we're just a bunch of like senses colliding just to say that we're all like that we all exist. So isn't he questioning our existence, which goes against what's a given for epistemology?
Well, yeah, and this is kind of where I'm saying that no philosopher is that compartmentalized, right? Epistemologists tend to focus on that accessibility of knowledge, right? Knowledge theory. But that's not to say that they don't take that foray into metaphysics on occasion, because it's needed, right, to establish that we exist. Otherwise, accessing the knowledge of the world really isn't of any point if there is no world, right?
Right. So it's just that most of his ideas fall under epistemology. It's not like he went out and said, "I'm an epistemologist, and that's what I'm going to be." It's like most of his ideas fit under there, so that's what we classify these philosophers as.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Like Descartes, for instance, I put under the metaphysics unit, right? Because the sections that I pull out are really the metaphysical ones. But Descartes is also lumped in with a lot of the epistemology stuff as well. Because Descartes is asking throughout a lot of Meditations 2, 3, and 4 how we come to that knowledge, all right, of the world around us. And so again, yeah, no philosopher just sets out and says, I'm going to be an epistemologist and focuses on that. They have some questions to answer, and yeah, most of their ideas fall under certain categories, and that's how we classify them. When we look at epistemologists in general, we kind of pull out the common threads, right? The ones where most of their ideas kind of fall into that category. We find that there are common threads that are epistemological in nature, and that's just simply how we divide things.
So would Dawkins have got a lot of his ideas from Hume, or not really? Just because, like, I know they're both atheists. I know Hume never really came out and said it because it was punishable by death in that time in Scotland, but would he still have been influenced by him in some way, or are their ideas just way too different? They're just both atheists.
I think it's more the latter. They're just both atheists, so they come to similar conclusions, right, about things. And that's not to say that Hume really is atheist. Right? If you look at a lot of the other philosophies that Hume kind of goes on with beyond the inquiry considering human understanding. In fact, the inquiry also brings God into the question. The sections that I give you, however, are a little light on that section, or on that little bit. But you are going to hear mention of God, especially on page 126 and so on. Right? For Hume, God is a necessity, right, in order to make some certain things work. For Nagel, he doesn't really talk about God all that much anyway. Right? His theory of knowledge really is, well, agnostic in nature. It doesn't really matter, right, whether God's there or not. So, I would just say that it just happens to be a coincidence, right, if that's the case. Not to say that Nagel wouldn't have studied Hume, wouldn't know anything about Hume, but whether he's an influence or not, I can't really say for sure. I don't know well enough. Okay? Yeah. All right, well, let's plow into some of the reading. We'll see what Hume actually has to say specifically. So on page 123, an inquiry concerning human understanding, and I'm going to give you section 7, all right, of this treatise. There are a number of sections. It's a fairly light work compared to a lot of some of the other philosophies that we looked at. But section 7 is really what we want to focus on for our epistemology unit. David Hume writes this in 1748, so around the same time as the other British empiricists, and he is lumped in with those British empiricists. He does come from, the land of Britain, all right, and being one of those British philosophers, tends to look at, again, sort of that common element of using our sensory perceptions to kind of pull in information about the world around us. All right, so section 7, part 1, point number 1. Hume begins by saying this. He says, "The great advantage of the mathematical sciences above the moral consists in this, that the ideas of the former, being sensible, are always clear and determinate. The smallest distinction between them is immediately perceptible, and the same terms are still expressive of the same ideas, without ambiguity or variation. An oval is never mistaken for a circle, nor a hyperbola for an ellipsis. The isosceles and the scalum are distinguished by boundaries more exact than vice and virtue, right and wrong. And if any term be defined in geometry, the mind readily of itself substitutes on all occasions the definition for the term defined, or even when no definition is employed. The object itself may be presented to the senses, and by that means be steadily and clearly apprehended. But the finer sentiments of the mind, the operations of the understanding, the various agitations of the passions, though really in themselves distinct, easily escapes us, when surveyed by reflection. Nor is it in our power to recall the original object as often we have occasion to contemplate it. Ambiguity by this means is gradually introduced into our reasoning. Similar objects are readily taken to be the same, and the conclusion becomes at last very wide of the premises." So what Hume is really trying to say here in that first opening is just to get us to think about knowledge that we take for granted. All right. In fact, this is one of the bases of scientific inquiry. When we have scientific inquiry, oftentimes what we do is we develop, what do we develop, right, in scientific inquiry? When you do a science experiment, what's the first thing that you try to state right off the bat in your science reports?
What happens?
Hypothesis, all right? All right, so you always start with a hypothesis, your objective. What are you trying to prove? And what you do for the rest of the science experiment is you try to either confirm it or disprove it, all right? In fact, one of the greater models for scientific inquiry is when you make that hypothesis, trying to find ways to actually disprove it. Because finding the holes in a theory is much easier and much more effective than actually confirming the results. Because what happens when you confirm the result in a science experiment or in any sort of mathematical proof? Well, you end up doing a sort of inductive logic. Right? What you end up doing is you confirm the hypothesis, but can you be guaranteed that it is always going to be that way? Well, scientific inquiry says maybe not. Maybe it was just a fluke, a coincidence that you actually got the result that you wanted. If you do the experiment again, well, maybe again it was a fluke, right? You got lucky, you confirm the hypothesis, and you keep going on and on and on doing that. After 1 million trials, okay, perhaps you can probably say that, yeah, we've confirmed our results. But again, it's only a high probability at that point. If you find that one trial that disproves your hypothesis, what happens to the hypothesis at that point? If you find one instance where it doesn't work, fail, right? That's the end of the hypothesis. You're done. So you could have 1 million trials and 1 million confirmations of your hypothesis, but that doesn't equate to truth, that this is the way it always is. Whereas if you find one single instance where it doesn't work, your whole hypothesis is kaput. That's the power of what we call indirect proof. Indirect proof is where you disprove your hypothesis. And so Hume, in the opening paragraph here, is telling us about this scientific inquiry in so many words, all right? That when we actually test something or our knowledge of the world, or we assume that there's a piece of knowledge of the world that we have, as soon as we find one hole, one instance, one place where the hypothesis doesn't quite work out, well, then we actually have what might be termed some real knowledge, right? In this case, the hypothesis didn't work, right? So now we have to go back to the drawing board and develop a new hypothesis and test that. And the more indirect proof we have, right, the quicker we can actually accumulate knowledge that way. And the idea here is that it eliminates some of the, what he terms, ambiguity of the situation. Because we can confirm, but if we can't say that those confirmations really tell us anything, that it wasn't just sheer luck that we got our conclusions that way, then that leaves us still wondering whether there is an actual connection between what happens to be the cause and effect. Yep.
So doesn't that mean like all science is wrong? Because then like don't we hit a fallacy there? Because then when everything that science tries to prove, wouldn't that just all be a fallacy?
Well, you see, the thing is when you end up doing what indirect proof or proof by contradiction, right? Because remember, first law of logical reasoning is that you're not allowed to have contradiction. Well, as soon as you come up with something that is contradictory, well, you know entirely the opposite is true, right? And this goes along with the law of the excluded middle, right? That there either is a situation where yes, it is, or no, it isn't. So you make a hypothesis, you know, chemical A plus chemical B turns the solution green, right? There's your hypothesis. Well, you do a solution and it doesn't turn green, well, suddenly you automatically know that A and B do not turn green, right? So now you have a piece of knowledge, right? So is it always a matter of not having knowledge? No, you get knowledge, but it happens to be from the opposite end, right? Have enough disproofs of certain things, and then, you know, you kind of build up that store of knowledge based on, you know, assuming the opposite of that disproven conclusion. All right. All right. Point 2. He says, one may safely affirm that if we consider these sciences in proper light, their advantages and disadvantages nearly compensate each other, and reduce both of them to a state of equality. If the mind with greater facility retains the ideas of geometry clear and determinate, it must carry on a much longer and more intricate chain of reasoning, and compare ideas much wider of each other, in order to reach the abstruser truths of that science. And if moral ideas are apt without extreme care to fall into obscurity and confusion, the inferences are always much shorter in these disquisitions, and the intermediate steps which lead to the conclusion, much fewer than in the sciences which treat of quantity and number. In reality, there is scarcely a proposition in Euclid so simple as to not consist of more parts than are to be found in any moral reasoning which runs into chimera and conceit. Where we trace the principles of the human mind through a few steps, we may very well be satisfied with our progress, considering how soon nature throws a bar to all of our inquiries concerning causes, and reduces us to an acknowledgement of our ignorance. The chief obstacle, therefore, to our improvement in the moral or metaphysical sciences is the obscurity of the ideas and the ambiguity of the terms. The principal difficulty in the mathematics is the length of inferences and the compass of thought requisite to the forming of any conclusion. And perhaps our progress in natural philosophy is chiefly retarded by the want of proper experiments and phenomena, which are often discovered by chance and cannot always be found, when requisite even the most diligent and prudent inquiry. As moral philosophy seems hitherto to have received less improvement than either geometry or physics, we may conclude that if there be any difference in this respect among these sciences, the difficulties which obstruct the progress of the former require superior care and capacity to be surmounted. Again, we have this reiteration of the fact that, you know, if we are able to look at disproof, all right, at indirect proof, we're going to have much more gained from it than simply getting the coincidental confirmation of a conclusion. He also talks about this comparison between looking at this particular philosophical point from the standpoint of geometry, science, and logic, as compared to what he terms the moral philosophies. Moral philosophies being those ones where we're concerned with ideas of right and wrong and morality and so on, which we'll tackle in the next unit in ethics. These questions are much more difficult to kind of pin down an answer to, right? Looking at right and wrong and such. And so what Hume wants to actually establish here with the inquiry concerning human understanding is to actually look at something that we can quantify, that we can get to a more concrete, established sort of set of truths, to be able to look at knowledge and how we access it, before we actually delve into moral philosophies. And Hume doesn't leave the inquiry concerning human understanding right here with just looking at how we access knowledge. It's the foundational element for Hume, for sure. It's something that we're really concerned with in epistemology, and in particular in this unit. But Hume wants to take this a little further, and he will in other treatises. If you read a little bit further into Hume, you're actually going to see how he applies it to moral philosophy and so on. But before we can do that, he wants to make sure that we actually have a good firm grounding in how it is we come to know this stuff around us, so that when we answer questions of right or wrong, we have something to stand on. In fact, this goes back to our little discussion of those various disciplines in philosophy, those various divisions in philosophy. No philosopher, again, works in that compartmentalized a way. Oftentimes it is just a matter of classification when we look at various ideas from philosophers, and we kind of say, oh, well, most of their ideas kind of center around epistemology, so we'll kind of lump them in with an epistemologist or so on. But when it comes to answering questions about the world around them, a lot of philosophers do delve into the headier questions. All right? These are the questions that probably drew you to this course in the first place. Questions of right and wrong, right? Is it morally right to pull the plug on somebody that's brain dead in a hospital bed? Before you can answer that question, right? Because we all have various opinions on how that goes. If I asked you that question at the beginning of the course, what would have ended up happening is when we had this room full with 28 some students, it just would have been one opinion after another with varying sort of differences, and it would have just ended up being a shouting match between one side versus the other. Yes, you pull the plug. No, you don't pull the plug. Without necessarily delving into the question of why. Why would we even consider this? And so any philosopher that is tackling these, again, heavier questions needs to establish a foundational element of, first of all, do we even know that we exist on this planet and this world around us? Because, if we can't establish that single truth of existence, or if we can, right, one way or another, then we actually have a way of tackling that question of whether it's morally correct or not to pull the plug. Right, so a metaphysician, and it sounds kind of trite maybe, all right? Metaphysician says, or establishes the fact that no, we don't really exist as we see. We're all just brains and vats. Then pulling the plug on the brain dead person that is in the hospital bed is a no-brainer. Pardon the pun, all right? Because, well, if we've already established that we're all just brains and vats and the person is brain dead lying in the hospital bed, so are we actually seeing what's actually real? No. Does it make any difference if we pull the plug at that point? No. In fact, if they're brain dead and they're, just a brain in a vat, then what's the point in keeping a lump of jelly, all right, in a vat? All right, so you see how easy it is to answer the question if we establish that we don't actually exist in this world the way that we kind of envision it, right? Or maybe we do exist in exactly the way that we kind of envision things. And we establish that there's more to our being than just simply, thinking things. Right? Remember, one of the very first questions we looked at in our identity unit, the identity concept, right, was, are we just brains? Are we the embodiment of just our brains? Are we the embodiment of just our thinking patterns, right, our stream of consciousness? Are we just a historical dialogue that, is strung together? Or is there something to be said about our animal parts that make us who we are? And you see, if we can establish the fact that, yes, the animal parts are really important to who we are, then that also helps us to answer that headier question of, well, somebody's brain dead in the hospital, do we pull the plug? Well, maybe not. We might not want to do that because the animal parts, the body that is being, put on the machines keeping it alive, the life support, that's a person. And so pulling the plug means ending that person, right? And you see, that's a metaphysical question. We have to answer that metaphysical question, that one that says, yes, we exist, no, we don't, and here's how we do, or here's how we don't, helps us to answer that moral question. For Hume and the epistemologists, he wants to establish how it is that we know the world around us. That helps us answer those moral questions later as well. If we know that how we come to knowledge and how we understand the world around us is based on, say, cause and effect, as Hume is going to establish, then answering the question of, well, is it morally right for us to pull the plug or not, now boils down to a question of, well, if we pull the plug, are we actually affecting the cause, or are we actually affecting the end conclusion that the person dies? For Hume, there is no actual connection between those two events. There may be a correlation, but there's not necessarily a connection. There is a necessary connection. In order for us to kind of understand how the world works, we pull the plug, yes, it ends the person. But is it a real connection? Is it an actual connection? Can I find some way that the string actually gets pulled when I pull the plug and the life support stops and the person dies? According to Hume, we might not ever really know that. And so does it make it easier for me to pull the plug? Hell yes. Because my pulling the plug doesn't necessarily result in the person dying. It just happens to be a coincidence whether they die or whether they live. Right? And so even in these first two paragraphs, right, of Hume's work, we have some really heavy things to kind of consider here. That if we can actually establish how it is that the world is understood by us, then we can answer those harder questions. Is it morally correct to do this or not? Right? We have a system of thought that we can apply. All right, page 123, point 3. There are no ideas which occur in metaphysics more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection. Now, this is the first instance of where we have this term, necessary connection, of which it is every moment necessary for us to treat in all our disquisitions. We shall therefore endeavor in this section to fix, if possible, the precise meaning of these terms, and thereby remove some part of that obscurity, which is much complained of in this species of philosophy. And so here's where Hume, as an epistemologist, is going to tackle a few of the metaphysical questions. All right, because again, we need to know the answers to some of these metaphysical things to make sure that the epistemology stands. And so here's where we again have that bit of crossover, right, between metaphysics and epistemology. He goes on to say, it seems a proposition which will not admit of much dispute, that all of our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions, or in other words, that it is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt, either by our external or internal senses. I have endeavored to explain and prove this proposition, and have expressed my hopes that by a proper application of it, men may reach a greater clearness and precision in philosophical reasonings than what they have hitherto been able to attain. Complex ideas may perhaps be well known by definition, which is nothing but an enumeration of these parts, or simple ideas that compose them. But when we have pushed up the definitions to the most simple ideas and still find some ambiguity and obscurity, what resource are we then possessed of? By what invention can we throw light upon these ideas and render them altogether precise and determinate to our intellectual view? Produce the impressions or original statements from which the ideas are copied. Now these impressions are all strong and sensible. They admit not of ambiguity. They are not only placed in a full light themselves, but may throw light upon their correspondent ideas, which lie in obscurity. And by this means, we may perhaps attain a new microscope or species of optics, by which in the moral sciences, the most minute, the most simple ideas may be so enlarged as to fall readily upon our apprehension, and be equally known with the grossest and most sensible ideas that can be the object of our inquiry. To be fully acquainted, therefore, with the idea of power or necessary connection, let us examine its impression, and in order to find the impression with greater certainty, let us search for it in all of the sources from which it may possibly be derived. When we look about us towards external objects and consider the operations of causes, we are never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection, any quality which binds the effect to the cause, and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. We may only find that one does actually, in fact, follow the other. The impulse of one billiard ball is attended with motion in the second. This is the whole that appears to the outward senses. The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this succession of objects. Consequently, there is not in any single particular instance of cause and effect anything which can suggest the idea of power or necessary connection. So notice these two words in bold, power and necessary connection. All right, these are technical terms that Hume is defining here on page 124, towards the top there. And again, these are concerns from a metaphysical standpoint. All right. And he says, really, the idea behind, say, for instance, some of our most common understandings of physical motion is a relationship between what we consider to be cause and effect. One thing causes the effect of the other. And so what he says here is, think of, you're at the pool hall, right? You're playing a game of pool. Ever play a game of pool? Right? Billiards, pool, okay. Or even when you play, marbles or anything when you're a little kid, right? You roll one ball, it hits another, the other reacts by continuing on, right? This is a fairly simple physical concept. Yet for Hume, he says that the motion of the second ball attends the first, but we see there's a connection. We imply that there is a cause and effect relationship, but he's not so sure that this is actually true. All right? He does want to go back to what is an established truth, or what he thinks, or what most science and physics people think to be an established truth, that one's motion, right, precedes the other's motion, and that they're somehow connected. And these are the terms that he pulls out that most people that understand some physical motions here call power and necessary connection. He continues and says, the first appearance of an object we may never conjecture what effect will result from it. But were the power or energy of any cause discoverable by the mind, we could foresee the effect even without experience, and might at first pronounce with certainty concerning it, by mere dint of thought and reasoning. In reality, there is no part of matter that does ever, by its sensible qualities, discover power, any power or energy, or give us ground to imagine that it could produce anything or be followed by any other subject, which we could denominate its effect. Solidity, extension, motion. These qualities are all complete in themselves and never point out any other event which may result from them. The scenes of the universe are continually shifting, and one object follows another in an uninterrupted succession. But the power of force, which actuates the whole machine, is entirely concealed from us, and never discovers itself in any of the sensible qualities of the body. We know that, in fact, heat is a constant attendant of flame. But what is the connection between them? I mean, we have no room so much as to conjecture or imagine. It is impossible, therefore, that the idea of power can be derived from the contemplation of bodies in single instances of their operation, because no bodies ever discover any power which can be the original of this idea. We know that when we approach a fire, we feel heat. One happens to be what might be thought to be connected. And in fact, earlier epistemologists, wrap this up into descriptions of what we call primary versus secondary qualities. Right? The primary quality being the substance or energy of the flame. The secondary quality being the heat energy we feel, right? The heat sensation. We ascribe to that concept, right? What Locke terms a complex idea, right? Or what Berkeley calls, the interpretation, right, of that set of secondary qualities. We make a connection between the two. We say that one causes the other. But again, Hume's not so sure. We know that there's a correlation. He doesn't dispute that possibility. But he doesn't necessarily want to assume there's a connection yet. And the reason why he says we're not sure that there's a connection is because we can't necessarily glean what happens inside the flame. Right? In the same way that Locke and Berkeley had problems with making that connection between primary and secondary qualities, right? Or Locke had the biggest problem with it. He couldn't say for sure that the substance external to us and the sensations that we feel within us were actually one and the same thing. For Locke, he said, yes, I think I know that there's something out there that causes the heat sensation that I feel. I'm going to ascribe to that collection, that collection of understanding as the concept of fire. Fire being the energy pattern that causes the heat. There's a connection, right? That's Locke. For Berkeley, the connection was the fact that that stuff doesn't necessarily exist outside of us from our own understanding anyway. It's only God's understanding that allows stuff to be external to us. For us, in our own sort of understanding, in our own little world, in our own little microcosm, that fire, that concept of fire is all just our interpretations of heat, and we kind of make an assumption that there's stuff out there that's fire. So similar to Locke, a little bit different. But for Hume, he says, wait a second, you're trying to make this connection, but you can't necessarily find the heat inside the flame, right? Locke wholly admits this, Berkeley wholeheartedly admits this, and so Hume takes that same thought and he says, well, wait a second, if we can't ascribe heat to be within the flame, heat doesn't exist in the flame, because what is heat? Heat is how we feel about the flame. And if it's how we feel about the flame, then that sensation is wholly contained in here, inside me. Flame, the heat is not part of the flame, the heat is part of me, my own sensations. And if the heat sensation is only within me and not ascribable to the flame, then how do I know the flame actually causes that sensation within me? How do I know that there is an actual connection? Because I can feel heat without being near a fire. Right? Think about how many times we get fooled when we feel hot, but there's no discernible outside source of that heat. Right? Even when we're sick, for instance, and we're we've got some bacterial infection. Well, what happens immediately when you have a bacterial infection? You should know by now. You've been on this planet long enough and gotten sick more than once, I'm sure. What happens when you get sick?
You feel hot.
Feel hot, you get a fever. Where's the heat source? Well, it's not external to us. I can't see it in the fire or, whatever, because there isn't one. But I'm feeling that heat sensation. And so to make the connection that heat is always attended to by flame isn't necessarily true. And here's only one case of where that connection isn't always the case. And if there's even one possibility where this isn't the case, then suddenly we know that there's no actual connection between them. Not necessarily. And so this is where Hume actually takes this separation now, right? Saying that causes and effects, well, these are all very tenuous connections. They may or may not exist. Here's an example where it doesn't necessarily exist. And that's a pretty simple given. Through most of our lives, we attend, heat with flame. We make that connection. Might not be right. Point 5, he says, since therefore external objects as they appear to the senses give us no idea of power or necessary connection by their operation in particular instances, let us see whether this idea be derived from reflection on the operations of our own minds, and be copied from any internal impression. It may be said that we are every moment conscious of internal power while we feel. That by the simple command of our will, we can move the organs of our body, or direct the faculties of our mind. An act of volition produces motion in our limbs, or raises a new idea in our imagination. This influence of the will we know by consciousness. Hence we acquire the idea of power or energy, and are certain that we ourselves and all other intelligent beings are possessed of power. This idea, then, is an idea of reflection, since it arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind, and on the command which is exercised by will, both over the organs of the body and faculties of the soul. So we shall proceed to examine this pretension, with regard to the influence of volition over the organs of the body. This influence, we may observe, is a fact, which, like all other natural events, can be known only by experience, and can never be foreseen from any apparent energy or power in the cause, which connects it with the effect, and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. The motion of our body follows upon the command of our will. Of this we are every moment conscious. But the means by which this is effected, the energy by which we will perform so extraordinary an operation, of this we are so far from being immediately conscious that we must forever escape our most diligent inquiry. For first, is there any principle in all nature more mysterious than the union of soul with body, by which a supposed spiritual substance acquires an influence over a material one, that the most refined thought is able to actuate the grossest matter? Were we empowered by a secret wish to remove mountains or control the planets in their orbit, this extensive authority would not be more extraordinary nor more beyond our comprehension. But if by consciousness we perceive any power or energy in the will, we must know this power. We must know its connection with the effect, and we must know the secret union of soul and body, and the nature of both these substances by which the one is able to operate in so many instances upon the other. So, first case in point, how we know that there's no actual connection between certain causes and their effects. Well, one is a simple matter of our own consciousness. Our consciousness, our conscious wills are very much limited. All right, and so he says, as much as we want to think about, changing the orbits of planets and removing mountains that happen to be our way by just simply a wave of our hand or a thought in our mind, we can't do this. And so the very connection between bodies and minds may not really actually be there. Right? Remember the original Cartesian problem between mind and body? Right? The Cartesian dualism that we encountered was the separation between the two. Mind is independent of body. They somehow correlate, even according to Descartes, Descartes was a little embarrassed by this lack of connection, and so he again kind of, came up with some random brain structure and said, hey, this is where the connection point is between the seat of consciousness, the pilot of consciousness, and the body or the machinery, the boat that the captain sits in, right? Being the body. Descartes needed or wanted to say that there was a connection between the two. But Hume actually looks at this and says, no, this is another, pointer to the fact that there is a division between the two. That my own conscious thought may in some ways influence my body movements and structures around me and such, but I don't have absolute control over the external world. I can't, again, just make objects move by my own thoughts. And so if I can't do that, does my mind have any real power over external things? Or is it just a coincidence that certain things happen when my mind allows for them or wants them to happen? Point 2, he says, secondly, we are not able to move all the organs of the body with like authority, though we cannot assign any reason besides experience, for so remarkable a difference between one and the other. Why has the will an influence over the tongue and the fingers, and not over the heart or liver? This question would never embarrass us were we conscious of a power in the former case, not in the latter. We should then perceive, independent of experience, why the authority of will over the organs of bodies is circumscribed within such particular limits. Being in that case fully acquainted with the power or force by which it operates, we should also know why its influence reaches precisely to such boundaries and no further. A man suddenly struck with a palsy in the leg or arm, who had newly lost those members, frequently endeavors at first to move them and employ them in their usual offices. Here he is as much conscious of power to command such limbs as a man in perfect health is conscious of power to actuate any member which remains in its natural state and condition. But consciousness never deceives. Consequently, neither in the one case nor in the other are we ever conscious of any power. We learn the influence of our will from experience alone, and experience only teaches us how one event constantly follows another without instructing us in the secret connection which binds them together and renders them inseparable. How is it that I'm able to manipulate my fingers and hands and do stuff in the external world, yet there are certain things that my mind cannot control, like the secretions of bodily fluids and such, right? It just doesn't happen. I can't control whether my liver actually works the way it does. I can't control how quickly my kidneys filter out, toxins from my blood. I can't necessarily control entirely, my lungs taking in oxygen. I can control them up to an extent. I can't control them entirely in certain cases. In some cases, I can't control them at all. And so there's another pointer to the fact that maybe there isn't actually a connection between what happens in my mind and what happens with physical bodies in the world. Thirdly, we learn from anatomy that the immediate object of power in voluntary motion is not the member itself which is moved, but certain muscles and nerves and animal spirits and perhaps something still more minute and the more unknown. Through which the motion is successively propagated ere it reach the member itself, whose motion is the immediate object of volition. Can there be a more certain proof that the power by which this whole operation is performed, so far from being directly and fully known by an inward sentiment or consciousness, is to the last degree mysterious and unintelligible? Here the mind wills to a certain event. Immediately another event unknown to ourselves and totally different from the one intended, is produced. This event produces another equally unknown, till at last, through a long succession, the desired event is produced. But if the original power were felt, it must be known. Were it known, its effect must also be known, and since all power is relative to its effect, and vice versa. If the effect be not known, the power cannot be known nor felt. So how indeed can we be conscious of a power to move our limbs, when we have no such power? but only to move certain animal spirits, which, though they produce at last the motion of our limbs, yet operate in such a manner as it is wholly beyond our comprehension. We may therefore conclude from the whole, I hope, without any temerity, with assurance, that our idea of power is not copied from any sentiment or consciousness of power within ourselves when we give rise to animal motion or apply our limbs to their proper use and office. That their motion follows the command of the will is a matter of common experience, like other natural events. But the power or energy by which this is effected, like that of any other natural causes, is unknown and inconceivable. While I do have certain power over the things that I do with my body, because I don't have absolute control over this, I really don't understand necessarily how my brain, my mind, actually causes these acts of will. Even from a reductionist standpoint, all right, so to use the terminology that Nagel kind of brings in from modern day science and philosophy, looking at reductionism, where we break all of those things that we do or concepts that we understand around us into simple mechanical processes. Even if we were able to reduce our common, our common ability, for instance, to kind of wiggle the fingers, right? I can break this down to very precise mechanical explanations, physiological processes that are easy to explain, right? Wiggling my finger, well, how does that happen? Well, the brain sends chemical signals, from the various synapses. Those chemical signals get changed into electrical impulses that travel down the spine. They go down through the nerve endings. They go right up into these nerve endings attached to the muscles in my fingertip. They cause my fingertips muscles to contract and expand. And this is what causes the wiggling motion of my finger. Right? That's science. It's easily connectable mechanical processes. All right? But here's the tricky part. What causes the chemical signals jumping across the brain? See, we can explain with our science and our neurology and so on those physiological processes right up to the point where the chemical signals jump across the synapses. But we can't explain what generates those chemical processes. What causes our volition or our will, right? We like to think that there's some sort of seed of consciousness here. In fact, back in the 1700s or so, right, this was kind of, anthropomorphized a bit, where you might have like a little dude in your head that kind of, or little dude, little dudette in your head, right, that kind of gives commands and says, hey, brain, I want you to do this. And then the brain jumps to action and sends all those signals down through the body, and the body reacts with its muscles and so on. But what causes that connection? Or where is that connection point? And if we look at our modern day science, even modern day science hasn't explained this. And this is where we get into areas not of epistemology, but even furthermore into the philosophy of mind, where we look at, well, what is consciousness? How does consciousness connect with the real world that we live in? Is consciousness a byproduct of brain function? Or is there something more to consciousness here that allows, us to do our thinking stuff and to, identify our sort of personal selves? If there is a consciousness that resides outside of our brains, then we've got something else to worry about or try to figure out, right, in order to answer all these questions. If the mind is just simply a byproduct of brain function, then this also answers a whole bunch of questions and allows us to kind of tackle these questions of cause and effect. But for Hume at this point in time, there's a kind of belief here that there is a consciousness that is aside from the physical body, And the connection point between them is something that we don't understand, or maybe we cannot understand. Right? What causes our will to enact certain actions in our body, we don't know. So then he says, shall we then assert, so middle of page 125 here, shall we then assert that we are conscious of a power or energy in our own minds, when by an act or command of our will we raise up a new idea, fix the mind to the contemplation of it and turn it on all sides, and at last dismiss it for some other idea when we think that we have surveyed it with sufficient accuracy? I believe the same arguments will prove that even this command of the will gives us no real idea of force or energy. First, it must be allowed that when we know a power, we know that very circumstance in the cause by which it is enabled to produce the effect. For these are supposed to be synonymous. We must therefore know the cause and effect and the relation between them. But do we pretend to be acquainted with the nature of the human soul and the nature of an idea, or the aptitude of one to produce the other? This is a real creation, a production of something out of nothing, which implies that a power so great that it may seem at first beyond the reach of any being less than infinite. And at least it must be owned that such a power is not felt nor known, nor even conceivable by the mind. We only feel the event, namely the existence of an idea, consequent to a command of the will. But the manner in which this operation is performed, the power by which it is produced, is entirely beyond our comprehension. Secondly, the command of the mind over itself is limited, as well as its command over the body, and these limits are not known by reason, or any acquaintance of the nature of cause and effect, only by experience and observation, as in all other natural events, and in the operation of external objects. Our authority over our sentiments and passions is much weaker than that over our ideas, and even the latter authority is circumscribed within very narrow boundaries. Will anyone pretend to assign the ultimate reason of these boundaries, or show why the power is deficient in one case and not in another? Thirdly, the self-command is very different at different times. A man in health possesses more of it than one languishing with sickness. Were we more master of our thoughts in the morning than in the evening, fasting than after a full meal? Can we give any reason for these variations except experience? When there is the power which we pretend to be conscious, is there not here, either in a spiritual or material substance, or both, some secret mechanism or structure of parts upon which the effect depends, in which being entirely unknown to us renders the power or energy of the will equally unknown and incomprehensible? Volition is surely an act of the mind, with which we are sufficiently acquainted. Reflection upon it. We reflect upon it and consider it on all sides. Now, do you find anything in it like this creative power by which it raises from nothing a new idea, and with a kind of fiat, imitates the omnipotence of the Maker? If I may be allowed to so speak, who called forth into existence all the various scenes of nature? So far from being conscious of this energy in the will, it requires a certain experience as that of which we are possessed to convince us that such extraordinary effects do ever result from a simple act of volition. So again, he just reiterates that point about how our wills, our conscious wills, what happens in that seat of consciousness, our mind, actually connects to that body. He says we don't know how that works. Maybe there is no connection.